What really grounds me every day when I wake up is the knowledge that buildings in this country are responsible for almost half of all greenhouse gas emissions. And I don't say that lightly. I think that needs to sink into everybody's brains here, particularly if you're an architect or if you're in the world of building buildings, the built environment. We're half the issue. In Alexandria, it's even more than that. Between commercial and residential buildings, they're responsible for over half of all greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if we think we have any chance of addressing the climate crisis that Stephen mentioned, we've got to do it with buildings, and we've got to do it immediately. Why do I say that? Because even though your environmental action plan of 2040 states what pretty much every climate action plan I've seen in any city, any state, or frankly, any country, they're using the 2050 target of the Paris Climate Agreement for carbon neutrality. All carbon emitted needs to go to zero, a very different world by 2050. The problem is that that's actually too late. If we peaked emissions in 2020 and just a straight line down to 2050, just the area below that triangle accounts for about 600 gigatons of CO2 that we would be emitting. Number one, we didn't peak emissions in 2020. Number two, we only have about half that left to emit. So it's actually got to be much more radical than that. We've got to radically reduce our energy consumption, as Stephen said, in the next 8 years, 65%, not 50%, in order to emit no more than the 340 gigatons of CO2 left to emit the building. And at $129 a square foot, we said, well, if we can do this at our first attempt at a passive house project, why can't others? And so we went to the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency and we said, look, we showed them the project and we said, why don't you just push the idea of net zero energy capable buildings as standard by 2030? Maybe they don't put the solar on the roof, but they design it as a passive house building. And they said yes. The goal is net zero carbon neutrality, but the best tool I've found is passive house, and they agreed. They said, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we incentivize developers to build to this standard? And that's when I learned about the low-income housing tax credit program and the QAP application process. And as you all know, in every state it's slightly different, but Pennsylvania was 120 points. The more points you get, the more opportunity you have to get funded. It's extremely competitive in every state that I've talked to. And so they suggested, let's just put an extra 10 optional points in here for passive house, see what happens. Well, what happened was 38% of the projects that applied, there were about 100 projects, 38% of them came in as passive house projects. Why? Not because they wanted necessarily to do the passive house projects, but because they wanted the 10 points. They wanted to get funded. So that competitive nature of the QAP actually is the secret sauce in getting these projects to make sense. Now, the question is, PHFA funded 7 multifamily projects here. Well, how did they look in terms of cost effectiveness? Well, these are the cost per square foot, the hard costs of all those projects that applied. All the white ones are code built applications. All the orange and yellow are the passive house projects. Well, we compared the code built to the passive house projects, and it turned out that it costs 2.5% more for the passive house projects than the code built projects. PHFA said, you can do that within your contingency. This is fantastic. And they said, let's do it, let's go. And so they funded these 7 projects, they all got built. The question was, Did they get built for what they said that they would build them for at application? Well, turns out, yes, they did. These are people that, these are developers that have not done passive house before. And yet at application, they were $161 a square foot on average, and they got built for $168 a square foot within their contingency. Same exact thing for the non-passive house projects. They cost a little bit more at completion, but within their contingency. And so the point is, they got built with inexperienced builders, architects, and developers for the cost that they said that they would build them for. Oops. Second year, they funded 10 projects. And we did the same comparison again. And guess what happened? It flipped. The passive house projects came in about 2% less. And again, I don't care about whether it's 2% more or less. I think the point here is that these high performance projects, these buildings that are using 75 to 80% less energy than typical code buildings, are being built on par with code buildings. And here are all those projects that were funded and are now built. The second and third, or the third and fourth year, 8 more projects. Exactly the same thing happened. Exactly the same difference, delta, between the non-passive house projects and the passive house project. This is the point I want to make for all the developers out there, as well as the housing finance agencies. This is a typical allowance for a one-bedroom apartment in terms of utilities. Well, the owner went back and said, well, look, and this was conservative. He said, look, we're going to be able to cut that in half. So I should be able to generate more revenue, right? Because as you all know, 30% of somebody's income goes towards rent and utilities. Well, what happens when the utilities come down? The rent should go up, so the revenue should increase. And that was the argument he made. And he said, I should be able to pull more money out of this project. And that's exactly what he did. He pulled $300,000 in further debt out of the building. And I just love what he says here. Passive house lets you borrow, leverage more money to build more housing. So this isn't just solving the climate crisis. This is solving an affordable housing crisis, not to mention an equity crisis and a health crisis as well, because these are the healthiest buildings you can live in.
One question that we see a lot in the city, and in any city, I think, is developers come to the planning commission, they come to council and they say, we would like to do zero energy buildings or passive buildings, but we just can't do it because our builders aren't ready, our architects don't know how to do it, and because of that, it's going to cost us a lot more. And this guy, Tim McDonald, might be able to do it, but we don't have a Tim McDonald here. Let's address that. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
I mean, that is precisely, by the way, I spent a summer cold calling 40 other housing finance agencies, just called them up, tried to find the right person in the housing finance agency to talk to about this. And every single one of them didn't know what passive house was. Every single one of them said it costs too much, even though they didn't know what it was. It has to cost too much. And so the whole point of my narrative to them was, here is evidence that it doesn't have to. And it's not just, but at this point, now that we've got years and years, hundreds of buildings being built and data that backs up that it doesn't have to cost more, what more do people want? Because you can imagine how difficult it would have been if we didn't have that one building that we built when we went to PHFA and we said, look, we demonstrated it that it can be done here. They use that to leverage the ability for other people to do it. They're doing it. It's not me. It's hundreds of developers that, frankly, most of them don't care. They're only doing it because of the competitive nature of the QAP. But the reality is when they do it, would you go backwards? If you built a building as a developer that uses 75 to 80% less energy, and you built it at the same cost as you build a code built building, would you go backwards on the next project that you did? I don't think so. So my answer to that question is just look at I'll give you a 2-hour presentation, and I'll go into individual buildings that other developers and architects and engineers and builders have built and the costs at which they've built them. So what it boils down to is you need the right team to do this, and you need to be committed. If you're not committed, then you're going to find all kinds of reasons why it could be more expensive. But my answer to how is it possible, when people say, how is it possible that those passive house buildings came in 2% less on average than the code built buildings? And I said, it's very simple. When people are forced to do something, they get creative, right? That's why I don't like pilots, because you're not forcing anybody into doing anything. You're saying this is an experiment, and because it's a pilot, it's necessarily experimental and it's necessarily more costly. Rather than do that, just say, here, just everybody do it. And then collectively, we'll come to understand, as we have in the past 5 years, that it's totally possible. I think the first thing that anybody says to me when I bring this up in affordable housing circles is cost, which is why I focus so much on costs. So if you take anything away from this presentation, take this away. If cost isn't the issue, why wouldn't you? What other reason, aside from fear, haven't done it before, all of that? I get that. But if there is so much evidence out there that if you have the right team, you can build these buildings that use a quarter of what they consume at the same cost. Why wouldn't you? And I'll leave it at that.